and she is going to be doing the last panel for today, which is Decolonizing Art Institutions. And this panel is going to be discussing about how circumpolar north art institutions are working to decolonize and create more respectful relationships with Indigenous communities. But while that process is ongoing, it is not without its challenges. So I want you guys to relax, enjoy your coffee. I know it's really strong. I had some, I'm getting a little zing. And I'm gonna pass it over to Nivi Christensen.
Boop, boop. Yep. Everything works. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. I know that there is a ton of different activities all around, but I'm happy that you have decided to join us. If you feel like coming closer, that would be very nice for us. We have already addressed the fact that some of us feel uncomfortable at this panel, but together with you guys, I think it would be more pleasant to also maybe, if you have questions, join us along the way. Thank you so much. My name is Nivi Christensen, and I'm the director of Nuuk Art Museum. Titles really matter very little to me. A director, I'm also the senator. I'm also very good at putting nails in the wall. I'm the curator. I'm one out of two and a half people working at the museum, which means that we do everything. So I really don't want to introduce a lot today. I really don't want it to be a lot about titles and a lot about degrees. I really want it to be a discussion. We just talked about how the discussion could just as well have been at a bar. So I hope you will be here feeling a little bit like sitting at a bar, drinking a cup of coffee, and discussing this issue with us. Or whiskey, if you prefer, or just coffee, or whatever. But the fact is, this title, Decolonizing Art Institutions, has been the titles of a ton of huge conferences alone. We have 1 hour at a bar, and we will get nowhere. I'm very sure about that. But I really hope that we can just have that conversation, inspire each other a little bit, and reflect on how far we've gone until now. I have been given the role of host. I haven't been one of the ones choosing who I'm at this bar with, but I'm very happy to join this bar with you. Stephen Loft, Kananyan Kahaka, was that sort of okay?
Ganyangahaga.
Nice. Turtle Clan of the Six Nations of Grand River, of Jewish descent as well. As well. Recently named Vice President of Indigenous Ways and Decolonization at the National Gallery of Canada. He's a curator, scholar,
Don't do my bio.
No,
Nobody needs to
exactly,
know who I am.
nobody knows it. Nobody needs to know. But that was actually the last things I wrote as well.
Okay, cool.
Curator, scholar, writer, media artist, and much, much more. That's the end of my note for that one. Sorry. Because the descriptions are long.
They are.
Unless you look at Laura's description. Because Laura's description is very short. Laura is an Inuk from Galaslit Nonat, from Nuuk. No. A master student from Sisimiut, living in Nuuk at the moment. A master student at Elisima de Sarfik, at the Department of Culture and Social History, a musician. And what you did not write was a key force in some of these new areas going around in Greenland, decolonizing debates. Don't feel comfortable about that, I guess?
I did not know that.
No, I know that. And has been one of the key forces in the Arctic Sound Festival in Sisimiut as well.
I did know that.
You did know that. Anni-Kristiina Juuso, Sami actress, reindeer herder, lawyer, addressing with focus on Indigenous and human rights. Yeah. I don't want to say a lot. Candice, Hopkins, Kakras, Takish First Nation, from right around this corner. Independent curator, writer, researcher, and local to Whitehorse. That's sort of what I wanted to say. Before attending this panel, I've sent you a couple of questions, some of you at least. Because I wanted to ask, what is the current status of decolonizing art institutions from your viewpoint? Has it been successful anywhere? Is it complete? Will it ever be complete? And what's the end game of this decolonization process? Laura, will you start?
Okay. I know about like art institutions in Greenland-ish, so that's like what I can speak on. I think that because it is art, then, you know, art institutions are very much, you know, a colonial construct, putting art within frames, defining what art is. I think, but art also has the ability to, you know, push those boundaries a bit, define itself, say what art is. But as we were also talking about at the actual bar the other day, there's also, in my view, in Greenland at least, like maybe an imposed understanding of what art is also, because there is a lot of great artists that are like musicians, actors, visual artists, filmmakers, the list goes on. But I think there's also some artists that are having this, that are like practicing the more like carvings, for instance, that do not necessarily have a space at art museums, for instance, or in arts institutions. And I think that, for me at least, would be like a very good example of how you could like push the boundaries of what is considered art and what has a place in art institutions. So art does not become for the elite only as well.
You also mentioned the other day that you thought that decolonization, it should be indigenization, and that's also some of the things you're talking about.
I don't know if decolonization is indigenization, but I think maybe decolonizing arts institution is partly also indigenizing them. I don't know if it's the same, but I mean, I think also that, yeah, we talked a lot about like pushing the boundaries of what art is, and you talked about like moving a nail, like putting up, like showing things that are like that exist already. But I think also because like arts institutions, if they are a physical place, then I think also that it kind of also limits the space of showcasing or creating art. So maybe the thing is that we maybe actually need to rethink art.
Candice Hopkins, do you want to comment?
Okay. I want to build on what you said, because you put a lot of important things on this imaginary table here at our bar. Cheers, yes. Kind of want to unpack this question a little bit. And one, as you've already said, art institutions are inherently colonial. We didn't invent them, in part because art itself is too narrow a construct for what we do. So it's too narrow a construct for what we do, what we make, how we understand our cultural belongings. And I think that it also, art institutions often do a pretty bad job of contextualizing our cultural belongings, whether they're there by our own regard or whether they were stolen from us. So I wanted to tell just it's a short story. It's a short story because I think it's a really good example. And it was an action done by someone I deeply respect. He's since passed on. He was a Kwakwaka'wakw artist named Bo Dick. In 2012, he staged an action that I think is one of the most brilliant, underhanded, perhaps even anarchist actions that I had heard of. And I think sometimes the best actions are things you don't witness directly, but they become rumor and then they become myth. So what he did was he lived and worked primarily between Alert Bay, which is a Kwakwaka'wakw community in Vancouver, BC. And he had often at least 4 or 5 commercial galleries kind of pitted against one another to have the right to sell his work because he was that good of a carver. So he had an exhibition at a place called Macaulay Fine Art, and I think Sarah's actually here. I don't know about in the audience, but she's here right now in Whitehorse. And he had on the wall 40 atlakim, or 40 forest mass. Every single one of those mass has a song, it has a dance, and collectively it tells a story about a little boy whose father was really mean to him. So he escaped to the forest and became friends with the forest beings who taught him everything that he needed to know about life. But midway through the exhibition at his one of his commercial galleries, Bo took every single one of those masks off the wall. He took them back to Alert Bay, and you have to understand that these masks have a social life much greater than that temporary moment when they were in that white cube. Much, much greater, much more important role within community. And some of them were danced for a final time. They're danced 4 times. It doesn't mean 4 years. And then they were ceremonially burned. And the people that he invited along with his community to witness this were his gallerists, his collectors, other artists. And they were literally seeing, future prophets go up in smoke. And that's because the Atlakim masks are part of the potlatch system, right? Which is the way that we govern ourselves, also as Tlingit people. It's the way that wealth is bestowed, and wealth understood not as monetary wealth, but cultural wealth. And it's also the way that they continue to be remade. And I think that was what he was trying to underscore, is that this act of destruction was inherently an act of creation. But it's one that showed the very narrow-minded confines, not only of the gallery system, the commercial system, the museum system, their inabilities to contain what we do. And I also wanted to, shared that story, but I also wanted to make this distinction that borrowed from a friend of mine, David Garneau, and he put also on this table that I hope he's okay with me sharing, that there's a difference between decolonial and non-colonial, right? Non-colonial are those things that we do that have never been colonial. And I think it's super important not to forget that we have those ways as well. So I'll end there.
Yep. Anni, do you have any comments on that?
Is it my turn? Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's an honor because I really don't know what I do here. First of all,
The spa.
I'm an Indigenous Sami from the nowadays called Sweden-Finland border area there, Sweden-Finland, from the Nordic countries, reindeer herder, and living just a normal Sami life. In my point of view, life is art. So even if you're an artist or not, you're an artist and your life is art. So for me, this talking about art institutions and decolonizing art institution was like, okay, let me think, what is an art institution? And what does decolonizing art institutions mean? Art institutions, as I Googled it, I found a lot of museums, repatriation, restitution, all that kind of high cultural stuff. But for me, art institutions is, for example, me as an actress, normal actress, trying to get a job as an actress, but getting these words, okay, but you're a Sami, we don't have Indigenous Sami roles for you. That's kind of, wow, colonial something. I don't even know what colonial and decolonizing means, but for me, decolonizing means trust, respect, mutual respect, and understanding. Actually, I'd have a lot to say, but I'll tell you later, maybe.
Very good comment, thank you. Stephen?
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you all for your words. I just want to also pay my respects to our host First Nations and all the First Nations of this territory we now call Yukon. It's a pleasure being here, and I bring greetings from my ancestors and my elders from my community, the Ganyangahaaga of Six Nations. I'm going to go on a bit of a different tack because I really appreciate what everybody said, and I agree with you all. I think when we're Indigenous and we're working in what are very colonial institutions, we do that by choice. We do it to infect those institutions. And if we need to bring them down, like infections, they can make something grow stronger, or they can kill it. And I think we all understand that that's the position we're often in, that if we can't make significant and substantial change, then we'd rather bring it down. I think we do this consciously, and it takes a toll on us. And it takes a toll constantly, because we do not, you know, I'm very proud of my position at the National Gallery of Canada. It's the biggest gallery in the country. I'm the first vice president who's Indigenous that's been there, and I'm very proud of that. But I'm also very conscious that by doing so, I have to work for my people and not for the institution, because the institution itself is flawed in a fundamental way. Not only is there non-colonial, there's anti-colonial, and we have to be anti-colonial. And I think we can explore notions of what that means when we're taking apart systems that have oppressed and killed us and have been violent to us. And just because we're in art and culture institutions does not absolve them from that violence or that hurt that they have caused our communities and ourselves. So I'd love to talk to you all about that in a bar. But the other thing is that, you know, I think we have come a certain way, and I think we should all celebrate and rejoice in the fact that things have changed. I'm an old dude. I've been around for a long time, and I've seen the change that has taken place in the 30 plus years that I've been working in this sector. So that's a good thing. On the other hand, you know, so we can see Kevin Loring's in the audience, who's the first artistic director of the Indigenous Theatre at the National Arts Centre, that's the biggest performing arts center in Canada. Denise Bolduc, who was here earlier, who's the director of Indigenous Arts at the Harbourfront Centre, one of the biggest artistic cultural centers on the land we now know as Canada. Certainly, you know, there's been, I came over to the National Gallery from the Canada Council for the Arts, which is our public art funder, where for the first time in its history, we have a stream of funding that is specific to and for and developed by and run by Indigenous people in the first time in its history. So these are all tremendous things. But I'll tell you what hasn't happened, and that's there has never been an Indigenous CEO of the National Arts Centre, of the Harbourfront Centre, of the Canada Council for the Arts, of the National Gallery of Canada. And if you were here at a panel earlier, you would have heard our Assistant Deputy Minister was on a panel, and he spoke quite eloquently to certain issues. And you know, he's a very lovely man. I met him yesterday. He seems very nice. And given his position, I think we can all assume that he's very smart and accomplished in his career. But you know what he's not? Indigenous. We have not had an Indigenous Assistant Deputy Minister, or Minister of Canadian Heritage on this land, this indigenous land, this land that is our land. And that, for me, is fucked. So, yes, let's celebrate, and I think I love this gathering, and I love being here with other Indigenous people and others, and settlers who are our allies and our friends and our neighbors. But I also want to say, until we have control of the colonial institutions, and we also have our own institutions, when we have an Internations Gallery of Canada, what we now know as Canada, when we have an Internations Arts Center, when we have Indigenous Nations of this land Council for the Arts, then we will be in a decolonized place. Until then, we were fighting these systems. Thanks.
Thank you. But I would also address the fact that you're talking about this, these institutions also framing the whole thing. So making new institutions or infiltrating the institutions will still separate the different kind of art forms. It will still separate the visual arts from the music. It will most likely be institutions in the same framing, copying the colonial systems. And this constant issues about infiltrating existing institutions and building upon existing institutions and building the same kind of institutions. No, let's do something different. Yeah. Laura, you had a comment? Yeah? I think Laura
No, I
first.
was just thinking because when I start a sentence with that, it's going to be messy. But because I was just thinking about what you said, because like copying the same kinds of institutions as well. Because thinking about like tearing, like dismantling systems and so forth. Like yes. But I'm thinking maybe like, how do I phrase this? Because arts okay, I'll just backtrack a bit. Because in Greenland, we are so privileged to not be the minority people. Inuit are the majority in Greenland, meaning that most often now, I would say, the CEOs of the arts institutions, let's say Nuuk Art Museum, for instance, Ketuaq, for instance, the CEOs are Inuit. I'm also thinking because in some ways the institutions is also what is channeling, money for the artists. So I think maybe the question is like somehow we would probably need some sort of institution. Maybe the question is like what kind of institution as well. And of course, being a curator and being a leader of some sort of institution, or for instance, a festival or so, you also have a responsibility to also not just say, for instance, being in Greenland, you would not just say, oh, let's look at how they do it in Denmark, because that's what we always do, And I've also been thinking, because I've been trying to reframe what art is in my head for a while now, and I realized at some point that art is storytelling, but it does not seem like storytelling is art, if you know what I mean. So like what kind of institutions or networks or things that are not necessarily one of these can we have to support that, for instance? So I'm just, it's just thoughts, thinking out loud with you.
Yeah, we discussed the other day the fact that we have a new funding system in Greenland. It opened on the 1st of January this year. We still don't really know how to navigate in the new system, but we've copied the Danish system. And we were at a meeting in Nuuk, at a conference, small conference in Nuuk, where everybody agreed that the Danish model was the worst model of all the models in relation to funding, that's what we'll take. That's what we're doing. Candice?
Sounds like a horror show. I had some thoughts. I don't know if they all link up, but I run not an institution now. It's a project. It's called Forge Project. Because I think a lot of these places actually need to have a lifespan. And so one of the things that we're thinking about, and we're only a year old, is when will we end, right? We don't want to be here forever. And how can Forge be a case study for land back? It's a private organization, but I think that one of the end games for Forge is for Forge to not exist anymore, and for the land on which it stands right now, which is the ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee community, the Mohikaniak people, or in other words, the Mohican people. How can we be a possible way or a case study of a project folding after a certain number of years? Maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's longer, but I think ultimately it has to be determined in tandem with them. They were pushed off their land with over hundreds of years of forced removal, and now are in a process of coming back. So this area is in upstate, what's now called upstate New York. I don't know if that's a process of decolonization, but I actually think that all quote-unquote institutions, no matter where they are, should think about land back as part of their ethos, or else what are they doing? Will they ever be decolonial? And I wanted to note about that term decolonial. I think that it gives too much power to the colonial, because it always already acknowledges its existence, right? I'm more a fan, Steve, of your term anti, of course, because I think you and I and likely everyone on this panel like to be against those things. So I just wanted to put that on the table. I think if we're talking about decolonial as a verb, not a metaphor, where does land back fit into that? And land back tends to make institutions very, very nervous. And I'm really into anything that makes institutions very, very nervous.
Thank you so much. A couple
Could I
of
just
years-
speak to that
Yeah.
for a second? Sorry, I'm very sorry. I love that, and the whole idea of land back and how that makes institutions uncomfortable, because I think for me it speaks to this idea of, if we're going to talk anti-colonial, not center colonialism in our decolonial work, we have to talk about the obligations of institutions that purport to speak for this wide population that share a territory now. And instead, especially those institutions, for example, that have a mandate to, and I put this in quotes, collect, objects from various cultures. What is the obligation of that? It shouldn't be what is our right to have this living culture within our institutions. How do we give it back? And that can be done in a variety of ways. I think we can get very innovative in how we see that, but that has to be the goal, is what comes from this land returns to this land. And we have to understand our obligations to not just the makers, but the communities and the lands that it springs from. And that doesn't have to be here, because we do have works from other places too. But it has to have obligation with it. It has to have responsibility with it. That's the colonial mindset, is ownership. It's acquisition. It's control. And we have to give that up.
They're temporary, because they have temporary custodianship. It's only temporary.
It is. And I think that's so important, but they don't know that. They just don't fucking know it.
May I say something? Yes. A lot that Stephen has spoken, I've done some remarks, so I will do now get them done here and said what I've thought. But you talk about, and you all have talked about, that we own. It's ours. And not until we've got it, it's ours, then it's decolonized. And I totally can sign it under. I remember from the late 80s, 90s stickers, black and white stickers saying all equal, all different, all equal. And the other stickers said same, but different. Now it's like 2022, and that was like in 30 years ago, and we aren't there. Until we are there, until we, the indigenous peoples, have gained our voice so that the colonial white supremacy also understands, so that we have the mutual trust and respect and understanding. Until then, we're not there. We are not in the UN Charter, Article 1, Section 2, equal rights, self-determination of peoples. From this idea, I come to the repatriation, that, for example, the National Museum of Finland did just a while ago. They did a repatriation of 2,200 Sami, indigenous Sami artifacts or items back to the Sami homeland in northern Finland, to the museum, to the Sami museum. Okay, nice. I say nice because for me, that repatriation, like Stephen said, that kind of homecoming, they belong here, we own them. For me, I don't know any of those. I haven't seen the 2,200 items that have been repatriated, maybe that's a word in English. So I don't feel like they've come home. I come from the western part of the Sami homeland. Maybe in those 2,200 items, there are some items from us, but now they're in the eastern part of Sami at a new museum that's called the Sami Museum, but it's like the nation state of Finland owns and gives money to the museum. So they're again in another museum. Those items that, for example, for the Sami, those items they are not just artifacts. They are like, we've used them. Tools and stuff like, because, for us, they're not just like art. They tell stories, the items, but they're not like artifacts. But yeah, so I don't know. Fucking anarchist. Sorry.
I love the fact that you're doing this while you say it, because it's like, it's art. It's touchable art. It's not something you just look at in a counter or in a storage room. It's.
Yeah, you use it. We use it.
Yeah. I'm glad that we started talking about this. Some people call it repatriation. Many others prefer rematriation. And at Forge, and I'm just putting this on this table too for other people to use if it's helpful for them, we're going to be publishing a rematriation handbook that can be used, particularly in the context of where I'm working now in the United States, that's all based upon your rights under NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Repatriation Act that was established in the 1980s. And together with the designer, who's a Native guy, a friend, Sébastien Aubin, he has a really great idea. You know those greeting cards that you open and they make a song? When you open them, they play a song. Well, he wants it so that when you pull this out of your pocket and you're in a museum, it makes a song, and that song can also make people nervous. But in it, it will have your rights, it will have case studies. Hopefully it will be actionable for those if you see your belongings that fall under that act, that there's things that you can do to potentially bring them home. So that's the Rematriation Handbook. And I'm also hoping that it could be bootlegged in various ways. Maybe it could be used in other contexts. What you reminded me of that's a little bit sad is that even when our things come back, if they have conditions imposed upon them, one of those conditions being that they must enter a very similar colonial context in which they just left, they are still going to remain homesick, right? So I think that, yeah, I think that sometimes a better solution is for them to go back to cultural centers rather than arts institutions or museums. And this was something that we fought in Canada, and it started with a guy, well, at least some of it started with a guy named, he's the late Chief James Seward in 1967. He approached various colonial institutions, including the Royal BC Museum, the Royal Ontario Museum, what is now the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. The Royal Ontario Museum was a funny one because James said, the late chief said to them, he said, well, I have the ledgers here. I see what you paid for our stolen items that were taken under duress during the potlatch bans. So why don't I just give you the money that you paid back then? And the Royal Ontario Museum said, well, actually, that price no longer stands because now you have to pay us for all the years that they were in our quote-unquote care. And of course, that number, that care, was way too expensive. So then he spent, and others, Gloria Cranmer-Webster, have spent decades fighting. And in the end, one of the excuses, again, I'm always really curious about what the excuses are, why things can't come back. Another of the excuses was, well, you don't have anyone trained in collections management. You just think, well, we were the ones who made this. Of course, we know how to care for them. And then another was that, well, you don't have a museum. So they didn't build a museum at Alert Bay. They didn't build a museum at Cape Mudge to get their things back. They built cultural centers. And they did that to honor the items that were returning to their homelands. But other museums went a step farther. The Museum of Anthropology at UBC has done a pretty good job. So if you have belongings in that museum and you want them for ceremony, you can go in and you can use them now, or you can go in and care for them. And I think that this is at least something. It's not perfect, but it's something.
I think that's a really good example of ways that we can move forward. Hate to always be the Debbie Downer on these, but unfortunately, too often we still take that collection management way too far. Carrie Newman, an artist, a master sculptor, tells this story, and I hope he doesn't mind that I relay it to you. He was doing research on masks, and so he went to the Museum of Ethnology in Berlin because there was a particular mask he wanted to see there, and he finally got permission to do so, but then they told him that he couldn't hold it, and the reason was, or one of the reasons was, because it had been treated, because it's made of wood, so it was treated with a pesticide that would have killed him had he put it on. And that mask was created to be danced. It was created to live. And for him, they killed it. And I just think we have items in care that have to be treated in a vastly different way. And, you know, can we do it? Yes. Are we doing it? Mostly no. But we can. All it takes is this idea of shifting our thinking around Western museology to saying, let's treat these, and Richard Hill, another friend of Candice and I's, said this when he was working at the Art Gallery of Ontario a long time ago, you know, treat these things with the respect that they deserve, not what you think they need. And, you know, when we do that, we can fundamentally change, because then we can be custodians, because then we can allow, because for some time we're not going to be able to take all of these things and send them back to community. But could we do it in a way that was responsible, ethical, respectful? And I think we can. What we need is the will to do it. That's all.
we were talking about resistance before as well. This is sort of a little bit about resisting where we're going. One of my favorite quotes is, if you're not changing the direction, you end up where you're going. And a person told me some years ago, it seems like whatever you do at the museum is resisting. Everything we do at this moment is resisting the place where we are headed. And I think there is a lot of power in that resistance. I think we should really use that power that we've got within ourselves to not wanting to go there.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's an old saying, somewhat cliched, but every time we wake up as Indigenous people, we're resisting. That's, by being alive, we resist. And I think we all understand that. And I think that's what makes the kind of work we do really impactful and also very hard. I think about my colleagues out there, and I mean, on one level, I think, wow, we have a privileged position, but we also have this responsibility and a double-edged sword that is always there. And how are we accountable to our communities? And I think about that a lot, and it's like, how can I make sure I'm accountable to my community? Because if I don't, then we will just rebuild the institution in the same way. We'll just become the same kind of leaders that we think we're fighting against. And that's a danger. I think that's happened, and I think it's something that we need to think about and be mindful of.
Steve, something we glossed over, I think, if you don't mind me saying this, you started your remarks by saying that, when we choose to work within these colonial institutions, we're putting ourselves on the line, right? So then, what is the radicality of self-care within that? So not only thinking of the protocol of care of the belongings that come under our care itself, but the radicality of self-care for ourselves as we do this, right? We can't forget that, because these are often positions of extreme self-sacrifice. And you often, or I've had this, I know probably all of us have had this, been on the front lines of a lot of misinformation, outright racism, all of these things that my background is as a curator and a writer, but you often do that to put yourself between the institution and the artist. And we have to do that over and over and over again. And I think that what might be beneficial is, and I have to remember this for myself, is every time I find myself in that position, I should call it out. I should say, this is what's happening right now, and this is what I'm doing, right? Because we often do this.
But in Greenland in general, and also here, I'm very aware of the fact that we cannot be the ones doing it all. Because of the self-care, we are not enough to solve these issues of decolonizing, the 5 of us at least. Maybe with the help of you guys, it will...
It's just a small bar right here.
Yeah. But it's like, we can invite people to the bar, but we'll still be few people at that bar. I feel like, and I was really struck by, at the last summit, there were no representatives from Denmark. And it's the same with this one. And they are we cannot do it on our own. We need help from some of the big institutions. We need people wanting to fight together with us and wanting to learn. And right now, I still feel like we're quite alone in a lot of these areas.
Is that allyship, or is it something else?
I think that's a really important point. I think we have some really good allies, and I thank them for that. I really do. But I also think that they need to understand that now is the time to step back and let people from our community do it, because there are people within our community who can, and we just too often see it's you know, this, I won't call them the usual suspects, but certainly not Indigenous people being placed at the highest levels. And we have to have that. We have the people in our community. It's just a matter of stepping back from that last bastion of white supremacy. And like I said, I'm not talking about the allies that I have worked for and with, but I think they would agree with me. You know, it's time to let go. And it's always going to be about power. It's time to let go. And it's time for us to honor the fact that we need to have control over our own selves and our cultures and our destinies. And certainly on the land we now know as Canada, yes, it's a shared land. Yes, we can progress together, but it has to be Indigenous-centered and it has to be Indigenous-led. And until we get there, we can't really talk about decolonization. We can fight for it. We can resist the colonial. We can be anti-colonial, but we'll never be decolonial until we have that, and we have that power.
But Laura, you were also addressing, I think we have that in Greenland, but we have not decolonized.
No, but I'm keep returning to the thought of how to do things, you know, because we're talking a lot about being Indigenous-led and so forth. I'm just thinking, you know, Indigenous-led what? Because, for instance, would be a prime example, choral music in Greenland. For a Westerner, it sounds terrible because it is based off of organ sheet music. So like there was no organ, so people would just be like, okay, you do this note and I do that note and I do that. And it sounds terrible for like conventional Western music, but it is some of the most beautiful things you can hear coming from Greenland. And that would never have a place, I think. That wouldn't have a place in an arts institutions that is copied from a model that we know. And again, going back to what I said before, you know, because we were also talking about museums, and we have the, what is it called? The National Museum of Greenland in Nuuk. And I've been there several times, and I think it's super odd, actually, that when I come in and I go to the right and I open the door, and then there's this very beautiful display of our national regalia, which is odd that it's in a museum, thinking about it, because it's kind of like seeing your own very alive culture being put behind glass as something you may not touch, as something that is not for use, it is for being looked at, and then we can sit and, you know, somehow, you know, it's gonna like self-exotify and be like, oh, that's so beautiful, and it's like art, but it's also art that you use. And that's, you know, it's of course it's very beautiful. The museum is curated in a way that it tells the history of Greenland, and of course that is a part of our history. But it's just odd to see it in a museum because of the way that a museum is constructed.
But to me, the odd thing about that is that we don't then have like the apartment buildings or the fishermen's or the accordional.
Yeah, because
because then the national costumes become this static object that symbolize something of the culture, while the other things that are alive as well, a part of our culture as well, disappears.
yeah, I mean, put me in a museum. I mean, kind of. I'm very alive.
Yeah. But imagine if you went into that museum and it was actually the director of that museum who's wearing that for their day job. Like, of course we can do this in different ways. Of course we can. Like,
But not in the
we have to-
case, right? They're not in the case.
No cases. Like we've got to start thinking in very different ways. Like, again, why aren't the masks being danced when it's appropriate for them to be danced through the space? It's just because we have these conservation rules. Well, who made those up? Like, these are not, they're not set in stone. We can change the rules. We can.
Yeah, and that's why I'm a huge fan of like putting art in places that it is not supposed to be in. Because, for instance, at Arctic Sounds, the festival that I'm part of directing, we do pop-ups all over the place. There's this, every year we have dog sled racing. And if it falls around Arctic Sounds, then we send out some musicians to play at the dog sled racing, and everyone's like, huh? We're like, why not? Or we do it like pop-ups at stores, or just like how can we take art and put it closer to people so you don't have to like physically move yourself into a space that is, and you can go over and stare at a wall with a painting on it. That's great. We should also have that. But what if you take the art out and put it like in your face?
I think, art institutions can only ever represent culture. They can't create it, right? So that's the hitch or whatever. That's the rub, I guess, say. But I think your ideas are amazing. Of course, you just bring it to where it's been made. You bring it to the dog sled races. You bring it where people gather. That's the natural
Just
context.
exposing people to art.
But I was going to say something else too. I think that maybe being anti-colonial is kind of like having a chosen family, right? So I think that oftentimes in if you're going to choose your family, who do you want to be part of it, right? Like in Canada, we often fall into this trap of binaristic thinking and always thinking it's like Indigenous or not. It's not. It's Black. Our futures are Black. Our futures, are immigrant. Our futures are Indigenous, and we forget that so much. And I think that that's also one of our futures, and that might be anti-colonial too.
But I would definitely challenge that museums also create. Because the way that you curate an exhibition also gives it a different story, it changes the object, it changes so we also, I think, create new culture, like a different culture, or it changes, I don't know. I feel quite creative when at least.
I think
Culture or context, I guess.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
Can change the object.
But what we have some control over is narratives. And I think that, again, this is where we have to shift our thinking. I mean, I work in a very colonial institution that has certain set narratives that they replay, and they're based on a Western art history that does not recognize my art history. So how do we change those narratives? Because there's multiple art histories, we know that, and I take Candice's point very, well, it's Indigenous but it's Indigenous first. And it needs to be, because that's the land we're on currently. And I think that when we shift that narrative and we need to give voice to those who hold those narratives, those stories. As our good friend Jesse Wente, says, it's narrative sovereignty. And it's whose...
It's what sovereignty? Sorry, say it again.
Narrative sovereignty.
Narrative, yeah.
And that's our responsibility, is to provide that. So yes, we can create some of those stories. We can also amplify, because it's not up to us to always tell somebody else's story.
And I'd say the decolonization as a whole is narrative sovereignty for Indigenous peoples. That's it. When we have the power to define our worldview and who we are.
We have 3 minutes approximately until the actual bar opens, where we can continue this talk with. Do you have any closing remarks? Any thoughts? Any things we should?
Maybe they do. Maybe the audience does.
Anybody in the audience have some thoughts, remarks they want to share within the next 3 minutes? Or at the bar? Because then I think we should stop it here and continue the discussion and continue it with you guys as well.
I think Nivi's here on an expense account, so I think all the drinks are on her. Just a speculation. That's my narrative.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
It was a very interesting panel. Don't all take off to the bar just yet. Supper is at 5 o'clock, and it will be outside. There's also the night show from 7 to 10. And if you haven't signed up for the art walk tomorrow night, that is still available to sign up. If you find those Ulu earrings, bring them to the front desk, please. So I hope you guys all have enjoyed your day. We'll see everyone tomorrow at 10 a.m. Daga shoning then, and have a nice day. Na kwanuch ishing.
You'll never be forgotten. Too many have fallen. I can hear them calling. Too many coffins. You'll never be forgotten. I went on Facebook and saw that you were gone. Young homie flew away. He tried to stay strong. It's so hard to get the proper help up here. I wish all of our problems would just disappear.